Unification. When we hear this word, we think of nations like Germany, the ambitious release, the controversial sequel, and the disappointing reboot. Ah shit. But we never really think about England. It was just kind of there in the Middle Ages. They were unified enough to invade Scotland and to shoot the French full of arrows on several occasions. But when did this occur? When were the English unified? Well, in today's video, we're going to find out. And actually, it's not just going to be today's video. It's going to be several videos in a series about England's quote-unquote unification. Often when you ask people who England's first king was or who unified England, the name Alfred the Great will spring up. But it's important to remember that Alfred the Great was never actually King of England, although he is going to be very important to the story of how England was unified, or should I say, conquered. Now, when Alfred was a child around the 850s, this is what the map of England would have looked like, with several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms who were very much independent from one another and often at war with one another, and there was definitely no sense of unity between these various polities in what would become England. Now, there is a term which is Bretwalda, which is sometimes described by Bede as being some sort of overking having dominion over some of the other kingdoms, although there was never a Bretwalda who had dominion over all the kingdoms, and after the Bretwalda died, this never really carried on, so it just fell apart once again. So this really isn't a move towards centralization, it's just once in a while, as we're told by Bede, you got a very powerful king.
The first king to hold such overlordship was Eine, king of the South Saxons. The second was Ceawlin, king of the West Saxons, known in the speech of his people as Ceawlin. The third, as I have mentioned, was Ethelbert, king of the Kentish folk. The fourth was Redwald, king of the East Angles, who in the lifetime of Ethelbert acted as the military leader of his own people. The fifth was Edwin, king of the Northumbrians, that is, the people living north of the Humber, who was a powerful king and ruled all the peoples of Britain, both Angles and Britons, with the exception of the Kentish folk. He also brought under English rule the British Mavanian Isles, which lie between Ireland and Britain. The sixth was Oswald, king of the Northumbrians, but a most Christian one, who maintained the same frontiers. The seventh was his brother Oswy, who for a while ruled the same territory, and to a large extent conquered and made tributary the Picts and Irish in the northern parts of Britain.
You'll note that these over-kings who sometimes subdued other kingdoms are never referred to as King of England. And so it's important to note that there isn't this idea of an England that we kind of project backwards to the earlier Anglo-Saxon period, despite what we see in the last kingdom.
No Wessex, no laws, no boroughs, no havens of safety, no idea of an England. What you have done is laid the foundation for a great and godly country.
Bede was a Northumbrian monk writing at the twin monasteries of Monk Wearmouth Jarrow, who was later canonised, so technically it's Saint Bede, around the turn of the 8th century. And in Bede's work he wrote in Latin, he wrote about the gens Anglorum, which is the English people, in his Ecclesiastical history of the English race. So clearly already there was an idea of an English people, hence the fact that he was able to write the church history of said English people. And actually later on, and this is during Alfred's reign, when Bede's work was translated into Old English, we do see this term Englaland coming up. Now the English are referred to as the Anglo-Kun in Old English, this race or this people of the English, and it's probably a linguistic term to describe people who spoke English or who were of the English material culture, but what exactly that means is always a little bit of a mystery, especially for the Dark Ages. To this end, George Molyneux writes in his Formation of the English State in the 10th century,
"The vernacular version of the ecclesiastical history appears to use Englaland to mean the land inhabited by the English, an area that was different both from the Englaland described in Doomsday and from modern England."
As such, there is no real reason to think that all of these individual and autonomous kingdoms thought of themselves as just waiting to become part of one whole England.
Most of the extant evidence that can illuminate the extent of the 11th century English kingdom is from the 1080s or later, but the accumulated scraps are sufficient to make it very doubtful that many contemporaries thought of the kingdom as encompassing all the English. As such, it is inaccurate to describe what happened in the 10th century as the unification of the English, nor is it helpful to think in terms of the unification of the English kingdom, since the kingdom did not previously exist in some fragmented form waiting to be assembled.
It's very tempting to view something like the creation of the English state teleologically, thus that you look at it from the end, the finished perspective, and then cast that backwards. Teleological comes from the Greek word telos, which means the goal, the end product, and basically by looking at something teleologically, you say that because it ended up one way, it was always going to end up that way, and every step towards that was inevitable in some way. So for example, if you have eggs, milk and flour and you get a cake, then you could say that teleologically you were always going to get a cake. But of course you know that if you did things differently with your ingredients, you might have ended up with a pancake instead. In terms of the formation of England, what this looks like is looking down at a map today and seeing the extent of England, thinking that this is therefore the way that it was always going to be, that it makes logical sense that this is what England would be, and that the steps towards this process were following a logical completion or unification of a pre-existing idea or entity of England. However, like Molyneux said, the political entity of England was not simply the unification of the English-speaking peoples. For example, there are two clear areas, so in Cornwall, so the very southwest of England, where the culture was very much Celtic and the Celtic language of Cornish was being spoken back then and would be spoken for centuries to come, as well as the Cumbrian areas, so to the west of Northumbria, which had for a long time been the Kingdom of Rheged and then also the Kingdom of Strathclyde, were clearly not English areas, but they were incorporated into the Kingdom of England. Furthermore, we also have the fact that the English speakers north of the borders of England, which means that they were not incorporated into the country of England later, but they were English speaking, so much so that these northern Northumbrians, so around the area of Lothian close to Edinburgh, would continue to speak their language, which was called English by the people up there, and would evolve into the Scots language later on in time. So the term unification may be best avoided in this case, also because of the strong connotations it bears with the Italian struggle or the German struggle, for example, and the fact that it was only actually used for the first time in English in 1848 with reference to the events that were happening in Italy at the time. Now in England, of course, this structure of the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would take a lot to change into one political body, the Kingdom of England eventually. And this, of course, is the coming of the Danes in 865 with the Great Heathen Army, taking down first the Kingdom of Northumbria, then returning to East Anglia, then going into Wessex, and finally subduing the Kingdom of Mercia, although of course eventually the whole prize would evade them. In the next installment in this little series, I'm going to properly take a look at King Alfred's reign and how he managed to fight back against the Danes, and eventually how from the part of Wessex that he was able to save from Danish conquest, it did become a springboard for his descendants to conquer other parts of what the Danes had conquered from other kingdoms, and how that would eventually lead to the formation of the Kingdom of the English. But for now, what's important to remember is that Alfred was able to keep a hold of some of the lands south of the Thames, and from there to fight back. Now, especially after the very important 878 victory at the Battle of Edington, he was able to cement some control to the north in Mercia.
This is the peace which King Alfred and King Guthrum and the councillors of all the English race and all the people who are in East Anglia have all agreed on and confirmed with oaths, for themselves and for their subjects, both for the living and for the unborn, who care to have God's favour or ours. First concerning our boundaries, up the Thames and then up the Lee, and along the Lee to its source, then in a straight line to Bedford, then up the Ouse to Watling Street.
What the treaty between Alfred and Guthrum, which is sometimes called the Treaty of Wedmore, which is also later on in that treaty they lay out what exactly the law will be in the Anglo-Saxon part, so the part under Alfred's control, and what the law will be in the Danish-controlled part, which is where we get the term Dane law, because that's where the law of the Danes was applied. But what we learn from this source is essentially that there was a split between the territory that would be controlled by Wessex and that by the Danes, and that this would run up past the Lee, so a river that flows there, and then across Watling Street. Now on this map it is slightly further north because we're not entirely sure where the boundary would have been, although we can have some vague indication of where it would have spread. But essentially it meant that Western Mercia would remain not under Danish control, so would be Anglo-Saxon. but the extent to which this would be controlled by Alfred, because of course it was Alfred that had quote-unquote freed this area from the Danes following his substantial victory, is not entirely known, although we have several sources which could hint that Alfred had a fair amount of control there, which had previously of course been the Kingdom of Mercia, an autonomous and independent kingdom from Wessex. The man who comes to rule this western part of Mercia after the death of Ceolwulf, who, as the name you can understand from the name, is an Anglo-Saxon, who was a puppet of the Danes, and this replacement is called Ealdorman Athelred. And the interesting thing is that Ealdorman is not a king. It's not a term that's used for someone royal and autonomous, but someone who is subservient to a king. And of course, this king is Alfred. And interestingly enough, we see in a charter from the year 883, so a charter north of the Thames, so in Mercia, in this area of western Mercia, it's signed off with the leave and cognizance of King Alfred. So King Alfred clearly holds sway to some extent to the land north of the Thames, which had previously been Mercia, and of course this is a very important shift from him having been a king of the West Saxons, so Wessex, that traditional kingdom, to now also holding sway north of the Thames in part of Mercia, Wessex and Mercia. Wessex, the land of the Saxons, and Mercia, the land of the Angles, and this is where he gets his title from. But it's also important to remember that he is never referred to as the King of England. He, of course, was not in control of most of what would become England, and as I've explained, this idea of an England is looking at the facts and the history teleologically. However, he is referred to in a different way.
My Lord Alfred, King of the Anglo-Saxons, after the time when he married his excellent wife from the stock of noble Mercians.
So here, Asa, who is Alfred's bishop and would become his biographer, refers to him as Alfred Anglo-Saxonum Rex in the original Latin, which is Alfred, King of the Anglo-Saxons. And as I hinted at earlier, this is a reference to the Anglian Mercians as well as the West Saxons that had been obviously his people beforehand. So there is clearly a distinction that's gone on here, and we can read this distinction because beforehand, when he refers to Alfred's brothers, who were not kings over part of Mercia, he refers to them as the King of the West Saxons, or to Alfred's father, for example. And also interesting, of course, is that his wife, Aelswith, is also a Mercian, so there's clear connections between Mercia and Wessex, which in the later episodes in this series you will see will continue to be developed up until the point where it starts to become one polity, a polity which Simon Keynes refers to as the Kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. It's this kind of between stage when they are no longer just kings of Wessex, but the Kingdom of England has not yet been established, and that's the term I'm going to be using in the next episodes in this series, the Kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons, to describe this polity, although I will explore the relationship between Mercia and Wessex and how much we can refer to them as one central polity, or whether it's a decentralized polity under one ruler, or whether it's really two that eventually become one. It's quite an interesting question. So let's quickly look at what we've learned in this video, some lessons to take away. So first of all, it's important when looking at the formation of the English state that we don't see it as a process with steps towards an inevitable natural endpoint, because we all know how the story ends. We get an England out of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that was always the idea and the intention and the driving force behind the actions of kings like Alfred and later Edward, and finally, of course, Athelstan. Another point is that Alfred was not King of England as understood by modern standards, so what we understand as being the modern boundaries of England, or by his Anglo-Saxon contemporaries. He was never called the King of England, and a lot of the stuff in The Last Kingdom is looking back teleologically. I do really enjoy The Last Kingdom, so this isn't me hating on them, and it's possible that people were starting to think, maybe it's a good idea if the English-speaking peoples start to work together, but in all likelihood it was more a way of surviving an expansion outwards, and there was most very certainly not this kind of idea of we need to unite England, because England had never existed up until this point. So the idea of it suddenly springing out of nothing, which later when the nation state starts to arise, it's a different story, but for the Dark Ages that's not the case. And third of all, don't mention the Second World War if you want your video to remain monetized. Alright everyone, so I hope you've enjoyed this video. I will leave the names of the books that I read from in the description below, as well as some other sources, because people always ask me what my sources are, which is very good because then you can go and explore them for yourself and make up your own mind in terms of the information that I've presented here. So I hope you've enjoyed this one. I'm going to do some more videos in this style, looking a bit more in depth, because people do want to see things in depth, and this is what I study at university. So I've been wanting to make this kind of video series for over a year, but I haven't had time. So now it's the summer, and I think it'll be the perfect time to look into the dare I say, unification of England. Hopefully George Molyneux isn't watching, or should I say the conquest of England might be a more appropriate word to use. So I hope you'll tune in again for the next one. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I would love it if you could share it around. Thanks to the Patreon supporters and to everyone else for coming and watching and supporting me, and yeah, I hope to see you very soon. So I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.